house cusps, Gauquelin research, and a comprehensive view of them within active astrology. Some important topics for active astrology. In this chapter, I will discuss some topics that I believe are very important in the practice of active astrology. These are the Gauquelin zones, the stars contained within them, the wise use of the Gauquelin zones in exercising the symbols of both the natal chart and the skies of solar return, lunar return, and terrestrial return 1. The wise use of the Gauquelin zones to correctly aim a solar return, a lunar return, or a terrestrial return. The house cusps and the relative zones 2.5 degrees above and below them. The way to consider the cusps, when these are also Gauquelin zones, the differences and/or synergies in considering the Gauquelin zones and the house cusps, the planetary dominance in the natal skies, and/or of solar returns, lunar returns, or terrestrial returns. Let's begin with the Gauquelin zones. The names of Françoise and Michel Gauquelin will certainly go down in astrological history for the enormous contribution this French couple, through their tireless work, made to the art of Urania. As has happened to many innovators of scientific thought in the past, they too have often faced the fiercest resistance and even derision from many. But facts are facts, and however great the blindness of some masters of scientific steam, time will surely repay them for the immense effort they have been making for over a quarter of a century. This section of the text was written by the author during the 1980s. Editor's note. Michel Gauquelin deserves the credit for the works I'm about to briefly mention, as his wife joined his research only later. First, a misunderstanding must be cleared up. The subject, and the same goes for his wife, is not an astrologer, as some critics, whose arrogance and ignorance shine through, claim. He became interested in astrology as a student, as a child, more or less for fun. He later embraced the cause of critical verification from positions that had since become skeptical, and it is from this period that we can speak of Gauquelin as a researcher. All of the subject's statistical and critical work dates back to a period after his crossing of the Rubicon. It is therefore difficult to see how one can say that Gauquelin is favorable to astrology, when in fact he is one of its most stubborn enemies, despite the very favorable results his work has yielded. From his high school years, he felt the imperious urge to collect birth dates for statistical studies, and thus began his career, filling enormous notebooks with birth dates classified by professional category. Hence, the first setbacks. It's not true that people die more frequently under Saturn, or that soldiers are more consistently born under Aries than Libra. Meanwhile, our man was examining the first faltering attempts by some astrologers to conduct statistical work, and he discovered obvious methodological errors. To avoid making similar mistakes himself, he enrolled at the Sorbonne to study the laws of chance so he could apply them orthodoxly to his studies. Thus we arrive at 1955, the year of the publication of his first work, conducted according to scientific criteria and presenting the first exceptional results that would give him the impetus to continue despite general indifference and hostility. Kepler had predicted that there might be an industrious animal capable of finding a grain of gold in the foul-smelling dung of astrology. Michel Gauquelin set out to find that grain of gold, and he found it, or rather, to be precise, he found more than one. His and his wife Françoise's work continues, but already today the results are highly positive and can be summarized in three fundamental discoveries. 1. great men are not born under the same skies as ordinary mortals. 2. There are multiple psychological types linked to the planets. 3. We come into the world in cosmic conditions that resemble those of our parents. It goes without saying that these discoveries had already been known to astrologers for millennia, and that they were part, as they still are today, of the millenary tradition of astrology, rich in similar indications that perhaps one day will even be scientifically demonstrated if many little Gauquelins are born. The book published by Gauquelin in 1955 was entitled Influence of the Stars, Critical and Experimental Study, 2, and collected the birth dates of around 500 illustrious French clinicians who were found to have an unjustified superpresence of Mars and Saturn at rising and culmination, compared to the values suggested by the laws of chance. It could have been an error, and Michel Gauquelin looked for precisely this error, without being able, neither he nor the experts he turned to find it. He then repeated the test on another 508 subjects, and the law reappeared again with insignificant deviations compared to the initial results. Something big had happened. The young and tenacious researcher had found a lead, and he would never abandon it. Before reviewing the most significant results of his work, it is important to clarify the foundations of his research method. He decided to study the relationship between man and the stars as a function of the time of day. To this end, he considered the diurnal movement of the planets comparable to the division of a roulette wheel, in this case an astronomical one. This can be seen in Figure 1, a circle divided into 36 sectors, the same number as the numbers on a roulette wheel, each of which encompasses 10 degrees, 360 divided by 36. The 4 axes that divide the circle into equal parts are the most significant points of a star's passage through the sky, rising, culmination, and their opposites. Now, if we consider Mars and see how often it is present in each of the 36 sectors, in the 100,000 births considered, we will discover that the distribution follows the laws of chance, if the births considered were chosen at random. Conversely, if we extrapolate from these only those relating to major clinicians, for example, we find that the subdivision is no longer uniform on average, but presents very clear peaks at certain points. The points in question are precisely the 4 corners of the circle and their adjacent zones. This means that for the births of scientists, Mars is decidedly more present at the rising, ascendant, and at the meridian, together with Saturn, as astrological tradition indicates. After his initial successes, Gauquelin reviewed his work and had it reviewed by experts, fearing he had made some methodological or calculation errors. But no errors were ever found. Some asked him to carry out specific counter-tests, which once performed yielded identical results. The experiments were also repeated in other European countries, and from hundreds of cases examined to tens of thousands, the laws found were faithfully reproduced. With his subsequent work, Men and the Stars, Gauquelin formalized his first general laws. Here are some significant data. 1. In 202 heads of large companies, Mars was present, after rising or culminating, 49 times instead of 34.6, chance of chance 1 in Iranutu. 2. In 903 journalists, Jupiter was found rising or culminating 185 times instead of 150, chance of chance 1 in 100. 3. In 1352 writers, the moon was found very frequently after rising or culminating, being observed 292 times instead of 225. This influx is something that chance can only afford once in 100,000 possibilities. 4. In 1409 famous actors, Jupiter appears 283 times instead of 234 in the same regions of the sky. Chance probability 1 in 1,000. 5. In 2088 sports champions, Mars dominates unchallenged, but with surprising statistical significance. It appears 452 times instead of 348 at rising and culminating. This leaves chance with only a 1 in 5 million chance. Distribution of Mars according to the hours of the day. In 2088 sports champions, the circle represents the theoretical values. The solid line shows how Mars is present at birth in 2088 sports champions. Note the very sharp peaks near rising and culmination. The third dotted line shows Mars at the birth of 717 mediocre athletes. The peaks have disappeared. Some, reading these data from the dossier of cosmic influences from which they are taken, claim not to understand how they were obtained, implying Gauquelin's incompetence on the subject. This should not be surprising, as most of our senses have limited themselves to a superficial reading and a knowledge of the subject. Some, for example, are unaware that the subject in his studies divided the circle into 12 parts, so that in the case just cited we have 2088/6, the rising plus the culmination, equals 1/12 plus 1/12 equals 1/6, equals 348. From here to arrive at the probability of 1 in 5 million, that it was a coincidence, there are only formulas to apply, formulas that those who have so much to criticize in this regard should know. The Gauquelins have also conducted very interesting studies on so-called astral inheritance, that is, the similarities between the birth charts of parents and the birth charts of their children. Ciro Discepolo and Luigi Miele have also obtained surprising results on this topic, analyzing over 75,000 births. Editor's note. According to astrological tradition, in fact, children are not born at any given moment, but in the one that is closest to a chart, similar to that of one or both parents. The French couple wanted to test this supposed axiom and therefore analyzed approximately 30,000 birth charts of parents and children. The results were exceptionally supportive of the underlying astrological theories. Not only did they discover that children tend to be born preferentially when a star is at its culmination or rising, as in the horoscope of one of the parents, but they even established that if both parents have the same birth position, the effect is doubled. Furthermore, their studies also show that this analogy ceases if the birth is manipulated, that is, if it is artificially anticipated or postponed. It goes without saying at this point the importance of such findings. However, it is worth highlighting a few points. A. The statistics in question do not concern a few hundred cases, but tens of thousands. B. Tests and retests were carried out by probability specialists without any methodological or computational errors emerging. C. All results and initial data, including birth dates, have been published. D. The results described are, to all intents and purposes, incontrovertible evidence, facts, and not opinions. E. All of Gauquelin's work proves that one is not born at just any time, and that being born at one hour rather than another will have profound repercussions on one's destiny. It also proves, contrary to what anti-astrologers have claimed to date, that the planets are not rocks and that they influence our destiny. Now, let's see what we're most interested in focusing on in this research regarding active astrology. It's quite clear that those born with Jupiter, say 5 to 15 degrees to the right of the midheaven, in the minutes following culmination, or 5 to 15 degrees above the ascendant, in the minutes following rising, will have a dominant Jupiter, and this will entail a series of fateful characteristics and psychological attitudes that I won't go into here. The same applies to the 5 to 7 degrees after the descendant in the 6th house, or after the descendant in the 3rd house, but with a decidedly lesser power. This first consideration also helps us understand something that, if truly understood by every astrologer, should not give rise to any misunderstanding. For example, many colleagues believe that a Jupiter placed in the 10th house is the best and would prefer it for their child to a Jupiter 3 degrees to the right of the midheaven and in the 9th house. This could not be further from the truth, given that the Gauquelins have demonstrated that a star is much stronger after it passes over a point, not before. Furthermore, in the example cited, Jupiter will be in the 9th house, but due to its close conjunction with the midheaven, it will have just as many advantages from the 10th house as it would from the 9th house. This is a fundamental point in an astrologer's training, because if they ignore it or deliberately reject it, as some schools, though considered important by some, do, they may later make mistakes in any application of astrology. Thus, if they choose the right sky to lay the foundation stone of a new building, they will place a Jupiter in the 10th and not the 9th, losing many percentage points of firepower. Similarly, an inexperienced astrologer will try at all costs to place Jupiter well inside the 10th house in a targeted solar return, and will forego the much more powerful position of a Jupiter positioned after culmination, and therefore in the 9th house. We have reached, as you may have noticed, a crucial point regarding the choice of a targeted solar return, a targeted lunar return, or a targeted terrestrial return. All these rules are already written, and the various recommendations can be found in my text, Transits and Solar Returns, Ricerca 90 publisher. However, I have been asked several times to expand on these topics, and I am attempting to do so. We have already discussed Jupiter. More or less the same applies to Venus and the Sun. Now let's look at Saturn. Here too, I believe I've always been very clear on this. Have you ever read in one of my books that it's good, wise, or prudent to place a Saturn in the 10th house of solar return, lunar return, or earth return? No, you can't have ever read that. So why do you have doubts if we're referring to the hypothesis of placing a Saturn, say, 5 to 10 degrees to the right of the midheaven? Saturn shouldn't be placed 5 or 10, and possibly not even 12 degrees to the right of the midheaven. Never, never, or almost never, if we were referring to the case of a seriously ill person whose leg, for example, will need to be amputated. We might even accept placing Saturn 3 or 4 degrees after the midheaven, if at the same time we can place a Jupiter glued to the ascendant, and perhaps a Venus in the 6th house. The situation is different for Mars, but this too is explained in the aforementioned book, and in reference to Mars in the 10th house, Sometimes it expresses a significant effort to improve one's social and professional status, one's emancipation. If I can avoid it, I won't place it near the midheaven. But if I can't, I won't fear this position as if it was Saturn. It's a completely different story if we were referring to Mars conjunct the ascendant, but there's an absolute prohibition on placing it near the ascendant, so the problem doesn't arise. And what about Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto? Everything already written in the aforementioned book applies. If we're referring to someone who risks losing their job, we'll avoid placing Uranus near the midheaven. But if, on the other hand, we're working specifically to promote radical change, especially in Deva's professional life, for example, then we'll certainly place it very close to their MC of ASR. Let's look at another aspect of the problem. If I place Mars 5 degrees from the midheaven in the 9th house, I'll also have a targeted solar return with Mars dominant, which will herald a year of struggles, battles, but also efforts and conquests. Can I accept a targeted solar return with Mars dominant? Of course I can, but if I can avoid it, it's better. I believe that these further clarifications of mine should be sufficient to fully clarify the topic for you. So let's move on to examine another item that seems to have something to do with all of this, but it's a different topic. As I wrote in my Italian book, Nuovo Trattato di Astrologia, published by Armenia, which I believe is an important text of mine, especially for studying the dating of events throughout the year, and also for applying my birth time correction protocol 3. For decades of my life, I have tried to understand the interference boundary between two houses in the Placidus system, which I have always used with great satisfaction, and not because I was accustomed to it by my teachers. For years and years, I studied a range of 3.5 degrees. Then for years and years, a range of 3 degrees, then 2.5 degrees, then 2 degrees, then 1.5 degrees. So I began to climb again, studying for decades the values of 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees, 3 degrees. In short, after a lifetime spent studying this as well, I've become convinced that the right measurement is about 2.5 degrees. What does this mean? It means, for example, according to my studies, that if Diva is born with Venus 2.5 degrees above the first or second house cusp, that Venus will function throughout his life in both the first and second houses. From this arise many and varied astrological consequences. First and foremost, the possibility of targeting a cusp and obtaining, for a given ASR or ALR, killing two birds with one stone by purposely placing Venus or Jupiter across two houses. But while placing Venus or Jupiter across two houses seems extremely useful and fruitful, it's equally true that doing the same with Mars and Saturn, for example, can be a real disaster. It's hard to see, for example, what practical use there would be in placing Mars across the third and fourth houses in an ASR. And we know that Mars in the fourth house of the ASR very often leads to surgery in the following months, so why penalize two sectors of the sky at the same time? Usually, sticking with the example in question, we tend, barring particular situations that require different decisions, to place a Mars only in the third house and not in the fourth. But wouldn't a Mars in the third house, say 4 degrees from the decimal point, be in the Gauquelin zone? Certainly. And what does that have to do with it? Being in the Gauquelin zone at the depth of the heavens doesn't mean the star's influence will be felt in both the third and fourth houses. Otherwise, why would it have taken me a lifetime to find the 2.5 degree measurement that guarantees almost 100% based on thousands and thousands of repeated tests, that beyond that measurement a star only functions on this side or on that side. In short, you'll have understood that, except for the midheaven, where perhaps a little more clarification was needed, things are quite clear and there's no need to try to follow any particular rules other than the famous 34. One last thing. The question of the ascendant of the aimed solar return or aimed lunar return in the radical 10th house. Again, there's no need to elaborate because I've written extensively about it in many books, but I've been asked to, and I'll add something. This position is perhaps the most difficult to consider when choosing an aimed solar return. In my opinion, only the astrologer's extensive personal experience can help determine whether or not it's appropriate to place an ASR ascendant in the radical 10th house. Usually this is an excellent choice from almost every perspective, a sort of apotheosis of the 10th house. However, if this choice coincides with particularly negative transits for the individual, then it should be absolutely discarded, as it could produce a reversal of the 10th house, potentially resulting in very unpleasant vertical declines, especially in the social and professional spheres. I would like to point out that this does not concern the position of the Sun in the 10th, or Jupiter in the 10th, or a stellium in the 10th, but only the position of the ASR ascendant in the radical 10th house.